Settlement of North America and the English Colonies, and this is a rather condensed version of that presentation. You can see that there's two essential questions there I really want to focus on. First, how these two initial colonies that were set up, or two settlements that were set up, differ from each other. And then there's this other event that takes place that is really kind of a hidden event in American history. Not a lot of people know about it or know much about it, and that's called the Great Awakening. And in many respects, people think of the Great Awakening really as a changing moment in the United States. Well, we should call it the English colonies, that prepared them for the Revolution. So as we get through these notes, really the last part of the notes, you're going to see that there's this event, and we're going to talk more about that because there's going to be, some other discussion about it. So let's start off with some very basics. This is all about Christopher Columbus. He's credited with discovering, we wouldn't say America because it wasn't called America at that time. It was called simply North America. But he didn't even call it that. He called it, well, he thought it was in Asia, right? So what's very different about Columbus, remember, is that most Europeans who had gone to Asia had gone eastward from Europe. They'd gone south around Africa, and they'd gone to the east to get to Asia. That area was very profitable, bringing spices and other goods like silk back from Asia. The problem was that the roads that connected Europe through the Mediterranean countries, what we call Israel today, for instance, Saudi Arabia, and all the way over to Asia, that road had been shut down. And that's because the Muslim Empire had grown from where Iraq and Saudi Arabia are northward into those areas, and then of course across the northern part of Africa. And so Europeans decided, well, we got to go around that, and so they went eastward, south around Africa, and then to the east to get to Asia. Well, Columbus decided to do something very radically different. It wasn't that Columbus discovered the world was round. Columbus knew the world was round. Others had talked about this. And so quite a few people understood that it was round. Columbus's mistake was that he thought it was much larger, or much smaller around instead of much larger around. And so what was significant about Columbus is he went west. He left Spain and went to the west, across the Atlantic Ocean, thinking that he was going to get to the Indies, to India, to Asia in about 32 days. And lo and behold, on day 32, he hits land. And good for him, because apparently his crew was very angry that it had taken that long. But the people that he discovers, well, he calls them Indians because, well, he must be in India, right? Or Indonesia, or the Spice Islands that are off the coast of Asia. And so this is why it was very different, because he had gone to the west. And the year is 1492. And he really is convinced. Now, it isn't until a little bit later that an explorer by the name of Amerigo Vespucci makes a map of this coastline of what we now know as North and South America. And when he creates that map, brings it back to a German map maker, the German map maker then, looking at Amerigo's name, puts a hard sound on the G and turns it into America. And this is where we get that name from this explorer. But the explorer is several years after Christopher Columbus. He can't be credited with much more than just knowing or determining that this is a new continent, a new world, rather than Asia. Columbus did use 3 ships, and they were the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Please remember those and don't get them confused with the Mayflower. Let's briefly talk about then the first Europeans to claim land. The Spanish were the first. Columbus was working for Spain, although he was Italian. And you can see here that the Spanish are going to claim a large part of land, all those Caribbean islands. They're going to claim what we call Florida today, what we call Mexico today, Central America, and really the large part of the northern part of South America, as well as the entire West Coast, is all going to be Spanish. They are way ahead of the rest of the world. It's Columbus is 1492, and in the early 1500s, 1508, gold is discovered by the Spanish, but we don't even see another European country come for almost, between 1492, a little over 100 years. And that's, the Spanish control this part of the world for that length of time. Okay, and it's really kind of important because the Spanish are going to have free reign to pull gold out of North and South America during that time, to grab land. That's why they grabbed so much during that time. So again, Mexico, Central America, Florida, the Caribbean islands, and the northern and western sides of South America. And they are seeking gold, and that's why they start grabbing all that land, because once they discover gold in 1508, at that point, they are focused, and they are going out and grabbing huge amounts of it. Now, later Europeans are going to be the other two countries, the British and the French, but really the French are the ones that came next, and they landed in what we call the eastern side of modern day Canada, and also what we call the Mississippi River Valley, which is kind of the central Europe, US. And you'll notice that a lot of what the French occupy seems to focus around major river systems. So for instance, right here you have the St. Lawrence River, and then this is the Mississippi River, the Ohio River, right, the Missouri River. These river systems are important to the French because of the fact their focus being beaver pelts. So they were hunting beavers, and they were taking the skins, the pelts, back to France, and they were turning those into, believe it or not, felt. They shaved all the fur off, ground the fur up, mixed it with some glue, and turned it into felt for making hats. And they were very popular in Europe using the felt from beaver skins because there's a natural oil there that sheds water. The last was, and by the way, the French showed up around 1603, 04, 05, somewhere in there. They first show up. By 1608, they've got a pretty solid settlement in eastern Canada. Now, the last ones to show up are the English. And the English, they're the last to show up. They're kind of the losers in the whole thing, because around the time the French established theirs, the British are starting to try and establish theirs. But the British and the French really are kind of, this is a race. The Spanish kind of finished the race, and the British and the French are sort of in the middle of it, unfortunately. So they're the last to settle the English. And they're left with just simply the eastern coast of North America, what we would call the east coast of the United States today. Okay. Their focus is gold. They don't find it. Their focus is fur. They don't find it. So their focus becomes more so business. That is, the British are going to use these colonies that they establish as a source of raw materials, of labor, and the purpose is here to start businesses in a variety of things, and then to have those goods sent back to England to be consumed, but also for goods to be sent from England to these colonies to be purchased by the colonists. So they're really building a market here, a market for buying, but also a market for selling in the colonies. There is this thing called the Colombian Exchange, and this is not has nothing to do with Colombia, just so you understand. It's called the Colombian Exchange, the word Colombian here, and I want to draw your attention to something. That is, we do have another place called Washington, D.C., Washington, the District of Columbia. And of course, you're probably thinking, well, this has to do with Christopher Columbus, and in fact, it does. Very early on in the history of this area, the North and South America were referred to as Columbia in honor of Christopher Columbus. And so this exchange really is an exchange between Europe and North and South America. But what I want to stress here is that it's a natural exchange. You can find this image with all these items on here, but really the important thing to remember is that very normally people, when they leave places, they take things with them. So you can imagine Europeans are bringing the foods that they like to eat. They're bringing animals that they, for instance, would use on a regular basis if they don't find them where they're going. And then at the same time, they're going to find things where they're going, this new place where they're living, that they're going to want to bring back to Europe. When they go back, they go, wow, yeah, they haven't got pumpkins there, we're bringing the pumpkins back, right? They haven't got avocados there, we're bringing those avocados back. That sort of stuff was very natural. And so the Colombian Exchange is not this, they didn't think, oh, let's bring this with us because it's not there. They brought it with them because normally people do this. They bring things that they think they're going to need or they would like not have where they're going to live. And this natural process over a couple hundred years leads to this sort of mixing of the two continents in terms of food, in terms of animals, insects, as well as diseases. And again, natural, not planned, but the Europeans have grown incredibly immune to an awful lot of things. And when they go to North America and South America, the people there have not. And the people of North and South America, the natives, are going to suffer horribly because of the diseases that the Europeans bring. But it's important to remember, it's not that the Europeans, said to themselves, "Oh, we know we have diseases, let's share it with these people." This was simply a natural process, and one that really the people had no understanding of in terms of how viruses and bacteria get spread. Now, England's first permanent colony is going to be the colony. They're going to first attempt to settle, and it's going to be an absolute disaster. It's called Roanoke, and it's referred to as the Lost Colony because, in fact, this colony is set up late in the 1500s, right around like 1585, and Roanoke is set up, and then the ship that dropped off the people at Roanoke left and went back to England. There was a war that ensued off the coast of England between England and France, and so the ships could not return to Roanoke. When they finally got back and they tried to go to Roanoke, Roanoke was gone. The colony was still there, the walls were there, the buildings were there, but the people were all gone. And it really kind of scared the British because they couldn't figure out where the people had gone. And to this day, we're really not sure what happened at this place called Roanoke. Well, as a result, it wasn't until 1607 that the British settled in this place that they called Jamestown. This is in the colony of Virginia. So think of Virginia kind of like a state, which it is today. Think of Jamestown as a city. This is a settlement inside of a colony. Jamestown is the settlement, the colony is Virginia. And it's 1607. It's still very early in the history of these colonies. This is the first English colony to be established. And yet there is a huge number of problems that exist at this colony. One of those issues is that the people that they bring on the ship, many of which, almost half of which, are nobility, which really are not, they don't work. They're not used to working. They have people that do that, right? They also don't bring, for instance, carpenters. They don't bring but one doctor. They don't bring but a cook who's used to cooking with food from England. And there's not a lot of food to find. And where they settle on this peninsula on the Chesapeake Bay, there's no fresh water. There's all this seawater around them. And the river, the James River, that actually flows past Jamestown into the Chesapeake Bay. The problem is that when the tide rises in the bay, and then the seawater pushes up into the river. To get fresh water, you had to go almost a mile upriver, which, by the way, that's where the Native Americans lived. And that's why there was this problem, because as they ran out of food and they ran out of fresh water, or they began to get sick because of the water they were drinking, they pushed into the land of the Native Americans, and these American Indians then fought back, and there was this conflict with these people. Jamestown, for the first 5-6 years, is going to lose about half of their population every year to starvation, to illnesses, and so on. Jamestown is settled not just next to the salt water, but actually right next to it's a swamp where they get malaria and dysentery. And so as the people try and drink the swamp water because it's not salty, they get other problems as well. So they've got diseases wrapped up in all this as well. This is a very difficult settlement. The British are struggling to survive, and with losing half of their people all the time, every year for several years, until Jamestown actually gets moved further up the river and they get away from all this nonsense. England's second colony is in Plymouth, Massachusetts. The people that we call Pilgrims settled there in 1620. And they came to North America specifically because, as a religious group living in England, they were persecuted. They were part of a group of people called Puritans. They were not part of the original or the official Church of England. They were Protestants, whereas the Church of England was more like a Catholic church, although not officially Catholic. And the people we call Puritans, Pilgrims, They were persecuted horribly, in many cases tortured, imprisoned. They were told that they could not own their own Bibles. They printed their own Bibles, and they were punished because of that. And so they really did not just come to the New World, they kind of escaped to the New World. And there's a lot of other things about the Pilgrims we could say about, their trials and their triumphs. But they came to escape religious persecution, or another way of saying it is they came for religious freedom. They arrived in November, and arriving in November in Massachusetts meant that the weather was already cold. They can't plant anything. And the result is that many of them are going to die. Unlike, however, the Jamestown settlement in Plymouth, the very next spring, they are beginning to build a community. All that whole winter, they are preparing for and building a community. Now they lose about half of their people to starvation that first winter, and a lot of the families begin to intermarry. So you have a father die from one family and a mother die from a father die from another one. You end up having fathers from one family join mothers from another family that have lost people, and they're joining these families together. And it wasn't because they fell deeply in love that winter and so they got married. It was because out of necessity we need to join families together in order to survive. And so the Plymouth colony was a colony that had the right people. It had people that were carpenters and cooks and farmers, and Jamestown didn't bring those types of people. They were focused on starting a business and making sure that the business was successful. The other thing that the Pilgrims did was they developed very good relationships with the local Indians. You may have heard of this Indian by the name of Tonto, and or Squanto, excuse me. And the thing is this Indian was actually spoke English, was actually a former slave that had been taken to Spain and then also to England and had learned English, was actually raised in a monastery and then brought back to North America. And this Indian meets with the Pilgrims and actually helps them and teaches them how to grow different crops and things like that. And you can see an image there of the first Thanksgiving, which actually wasn't the first harvest, it was the second harvest. Their first harvest, they struggled the end of the first full year to grow enough for everyone, partly because what they attempted to do is to have one large garden where everybody worked and everybody ate. But what they discovered was, guess what? Not everybody works. And the result was that there wasn't enough food for everyone. The next year, they separated the land into pieces of land for every family, and they said, you're responsible for your own family on your own land. And there was an abundance of food, and therefore there was this thing called Thanksgiving. Now, one of the significant things that happens during this time, the first couple of, the first year that the Pilgrims are there, that first winter while they're on the boat, and they realize they are 300 miles from Jamestown, they actually write something called the Mayflower Compact. And what you're looking at here on the screen is actually probably about half of the Mayflower Compact. It's very short. And I've highlighted three significant parts to it. So you're going to see there's a couple of statements down below. And I'm going to get to those in a moment, but let's talk about these three parts. The green part says, having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith. This is a statement of purpose. So that green part tells you, this is why we came, right? The red part, okay, tells everybody, this is what we're going to do. We're going to put ourselves into a body politic. We're going to form a government here. We came to honor our king and our country and to plant a colony, right? Now that we're here and we're nowhere near Virginia, because it says the northern parts of Virginia. Well, how big was Virginia at the time? It pretty much went all the way to Canada. Okay, so their understanding is we're in Virginia, but it's the northern parts. We're 300 miles from Jamestown, really not anywhere near them. So what do we have to do? We have to make a civil body politic. We have to make a government for ourselves. And then it says, why do we need a government? Well, because we need to enact, constitute, and frame just laws, ordinances, constitutions, offices, mayor, and so on. And we need to do that because we need to make sure that we make laws that are going to meet the needs of our community, of our colony. And we agree by signing this document that we're going to follow those rules. Whatever laws they make, we're going to follow them. The people at Plymouth were wise enough to know that no community survives without law and order, that no community survives without agreement by the people to follow the rules that are made by those in authority. And so they started this process on the ship before they even set foot on the land that first winter, so that when they went to the land and started building their homes and dealing with the farming issues and so on, there was agreement as to what rules, how rules would be made, and what rules they were going to be made and how they would be followed. Okay. So this being that the Pilgrims didn't land near Jamestown, they had no choice really. They had no choice but to set up their own government, and that's the Mayflower Compact. Okay, and they did this even before they had left the Mayflower. Now there are 13 colonies eventually set up, and that takes about 50 years to do. And those three colonies fall into these three categories: New England colonies, middle colonies, and southern colonies. And there are some significant differences between all three. In terms of land, for instance, New England's land is, there's not a lot of land to grow farming on. The land is pretty sparse. The land is full of rocks and very dense trees. And so the result in New England is there's just, you can't have a massive farm in New England where you can grow a lot of food and then sell it to the people. The weather in New England also is pretty cold, and so the growing season is rather short. They really can't start growing until, probably April or May, and they have to stop growing by the time they get to mid-September. And the result is that they have a type of farming where they only grow what they need as a family. They really can't grow more than that. That's called subsistence farming. And this type of farming is one where they're saying, well, you know what, we're only going to grow what we need, and we're not going to grow any more. And it's not because we're incapable. It's because, quite honestly, we just don't have enough time, and there's just not enough space. All right. Now, as a result, there's a lot of other occupations in New England. They're cutting down all these trees for farms, and all that lumber is going to get turned into ships. So shipbuilding is a major activity. And then on top of that, there is, of course, whaling. That's a major activity. And then, of course, there's all those other, occupations like, the ironworks and, repairing clothing, seamstresses and shoemakers and so on that are doing other occupations. So not everybody was a farmer, but you can honestly say that in New England, everything revolved around farming, that in some way it was connected to the things that were grown in that area, or at least to the agriculture of the trees, for instance, in that area. Now, you go just a little bit further south into the middle colonies, and you'll find that the land is different. Why? The land is much more flat and wide open. There are places in the middle colonies, like in Pennsylvania, where the Indians had cleared land before. Those American Indians had gone through and cut down the trees. And they did that, actually, not didn't cut down the trees, they burned things, burn it all around. But the result was that when the colonists get there, it's sort of prepared for them in a sense. And as a result, you have in the middle colonies really kind of a wide variety of both sizes of farms, family farms, subsistence farming, and also larger farms where you have people growing what we call a surplus crop, more than they need, and they take it and they sell it. And that was what was unique about the middle colonies. And when I add to that, the weather is a little more mild. The growing season, a little bit longer. They can start in March. They don't have to finish till October, as compared to New England. You go a little bit further south, and what happens is in the southern colonies, the weather is much warmer. And it turns out there's a much larger areas of land that are very flat. You kind of notice on the map that the southern colonies seem a lot larger than the northern colonies. Partly it's because the mountain range is further inland in the south, the Appalachian Mountains. And so those colonies were larger because of that. Whereas in New England, the mountain range is closer to the shore. Therefore, the colonies can't be as wide, as large, less growing room. In the southern colonies, the weather was more pleasant and warmer. The land was more flat, and there was a lot of open areas. And the result was they had some farms that were so large, we could describe them almost like cities in the sense. Areas that were so massive that it would take, for instance, a man on a horse just riding, casually, not galloping. It could take him a couple hours to get from one side of his farm to the next. And the result is that these farmers, and there weren't a lot of them, only about 10% of all of the the farms in the South were plantations, these very large farms with hundreds of employees. But the thing is that the result is that they're going to grow not just surplus crops. In some cases, they're going to grow what we call cash crops. They're going to grow something that their only purpose in growing it is to sell it. There's so much of it. So you find that in the southern colonies that, for instance, we have people that are growing tobacco. They're not going to smoke all of that, but they're going to sell it. Okay. Now, there are other farmers, of course, besides, because only 10% of the people are actually owning plantations, 90% of them don't. So most people in the South actually had very small farms. But one of the things you kind of notice is that if you're living in a New England farm and you're only growing enough food for yourself, then you really don't need any employees. And if you're working on a middle colony farm, well, some of them are large, some of them are small, some of them might have a need for employees. And then down south, there's a great need for, at least on 10% of the farms, for extra labor. And it was in 1619, shortly or right before Plymouth and after Jamestown, that the first slaves were delivered to Jamestown. And slavery began to grow. And what we recognized was the need for slaves in the New England colonies was very minimal. Most of the time, if you found slaves in New England, it was because people were working in someone's house. A very rich person may have had a servant, but farms didn't. In the middle colonies, it turns out that a lot of people were opposed to slavery because they were very deeply religious. In Pennsylvania, for instance, which was set up as a colony by the Quakers, they were opposed to slavery. Other colonies may have had slaves, like in Delaware. And then, if you look at the southern colonies, people had a great need for slaves. And even the small farmers that didn't own plantations, they actually would have slaves that they would rent from the plantation owners. Now, how did the slaves get here? Well, there was this system of triangular trade that existed. And the triangle you see on the screen is just one example of many different triangles that stretch between North America, Europe, and Africa, and sometimes even the Caribbean. Now, basically, here are the steps. We start off in the New England colonies and we load up a ship with two things: rum and guns. All right. So we got a ship loaded with rum, which is an alcohol, and guns. And that's made up here in New England. That then is traveled down here to the west coast of Africa. The west coast of Africa, African tribes have actually enslaved other African tribes. It was a very common practice for tribes to fight and the losers to be taken captive, and then they were sold into slavery. So there are entire slave prisons that are set up where they are just waiting for those Europeans to show up with the rum and the guns to trade for those slaves. Those slaves then are put on ships and they travel across the ocean. And this part of the trip, okay, which is going to the Americas, is known as the Middle Passage. This is the largest leg of the trip for the slaves in the boat and across really what we call the equator, very hot, humid, a very difficult part of the trip. And a lot of the slaves will die in the bottom of the ship along this part of the trip. All right. When they get to the Caribbean islands, what happens is the slaves are going to, some of the slaves will be sold for molasses, which is actually a product of sugar. So some of the slaves are sold for molasses, and then the molasses is then taken back up to New England. Now, I said some of the slaves are sold. Well, it turns out that the ships leaving the Caribbean stopped in the southern colonies and they sold the rest of their slaves before they continued up to New England. And they turned, listen, that sugar, that molasses, into rum. So we have rum and guns, we have slaves. Some of the slaves are sold for molasses or traded for molasses. Rest of the slaves are sold, and then in New England, the sugar, the molasses is turned into rum, and they continue the trip. And this is how most slaves came to the colonies. But it's important to note that by the time the English began bringing slaves into their colonies, there's already 3 million slaves that have been brought by the Spanish into Spanish territory. So the moment we have 1 or 2 or half a dozen slaves in the colonies, the Spanish already have 3 million. Right? They've already been in the process of bringing slaves into their country. All right, now we're going to end our discussion here of this early colonial period by talking about this first Great Awakening. And this first Great Awakening has several causes. Let's first of all describe this Great Awakening not as a everybody woke up kind of thing. It's not that they all went to sleep and they all woke up. The Great Awakening was a religious revival, and that's the best way to describe this whole thing. Is it's a religious revival. Okay, but what are the causes of it? First of all, by the time we get to the Great Awakening, which is in the 1730s and 40s, and you should know that 1730s and 40s, at this point, the colonies have been around for 125 years. And the Church of England has pretty much been the church, the official church of the colonies, which is the official Church of England. And so the faith of the people of the colonies has become kind of stagnant. It hasn't seen any changes. It hasn't really been influenced by anything else other than the Church of England. And the Church of England is controlled by the government of England, and so change doesn't happen. The other thing is that death was a fairly common thing in the colonies. Most people didn't live beyond the age of 40, and most children actually didn't survive childhood. So you would end up having, say, 5 to 10 children as a family, because you knew probably somewhere around 5 of them would die before they even got to be 2 or 3 years old. Any illness could kill a child, common cold, flu, things like that. You get an infection from a cut, you could lose a limb or lose your life. And that's because there's really no medicine as we understand it today. Now, being that death is so common, and that very often we see religion as answering the question about, well, what happens to me when I die? Many of the colonists were deeply concerned because they didn't really have an answer for that question from the Church of England. The Church of England was a very much established church, and it was more about keeping the people in line and making sure that they're giving money to the church, because that money then goes into the hands of the English government. And so when all of a sudden there are some preachers that kind of, well, they come on the scene like Jonathan Edwards, and they kind of buck the system. They kind of, well, they stir things up. They're referred to as the new light, the new the new preachers, the new guys in town. And what they begin to preach really did inspire people. Okay, we're not going to focus on their message so much as to say this didn't just change a few people in terms of revival. This started hundreds of new churches. This resulted in thousands of people walking away from the Church of England. This caused thousands of people to all of a sudden become connected to each other that had never been connected before, because they went to different English churches, but now all of a sudden they're connected through this new sort of religious movement. And so the effects are this overwhelming unity that begins to be created in the colonies. Yeah, the unity is a unity of faith, but it's still a unity. There's a boldness that is created, because the moment that these people decided to walk out of the Church of England, where they could get punished, for instance, in some cases, in some cities, in some locations, not going to church, to the official church, could mean that you could get punished because it would be a violation of the law. It was a government church, remember. So this boldness, though, came from the fact that they were willing to say to the English church, we really don't care what you do to us. We're going to follow this other church. We believe that this church is more, more in tune with what Christian teachings should really be. So there's a boldness to challenge authority, the authority of the Church of England, which was the authority of the government of England. And there's an increase in communication, because these ministers, remember, they don't have social media, they don't have television stations and radio stations. They have to travel from place to place to place to place to place and preach. They don't even have churches in many cases when they start. Why? Because the Church of England controlled all the churches. And it isn't until after several years that, in fact, they start building churches for these new ministers. So this communication begins to grow, and it's growing among the colonies, not just simply in a colony, but from colony to colony to colony. And the colonies are now talking to each other about these religious issues and about these religious services. And one of the big things that came out of this whole thing was these ministers were pointing out that there was this huge problem in the English church. There was the people that were in the government and the people that were the ministers, and they were all considered to be better than, higher status than the people that were members of the church, the average people. And one of the things that these new light ministers like Jonathan Edwards taught was that in God's eyes, all people are equal. It didn't matter if you were the person that, shoveled the slop out of the pig stall, or you were the guy that shoed the horse because you were a blacksmith, or if you were the person who was the town mayor, or if you were Jonathan Edwards himself. That God doesn't see any of these people as being unequal. They're all part of his creation. And the people of the colonies began to look at the situation and realize something, that they had really been forced into and to fit the mold of England. They lived in this different part of the world, and they really had not talked to each other. In many cases, they didn't like each other. But this religious movement bound them together, created unity. It gave them a boldness to say no to England. It increased communication among the colonies, and it created this sense of equality, that everyone is equal in God's eyes, regardless of the color of your skin, who you are, where you were born. That didn't matter. Not everybody agreed on it, but in fact, it changed people's attitudes enough that when the revolution did start, this became one of the focal points of the Declaration of Independence.